For 6 years, I sent $940 to a bank account that wasn't mine, for a house I didn't live in, so that two people who barely called me back could sleep in a home they thought they'd paid off themselves. I never told them. I never told my wife the full amount. I never told my brother anything at all. I did it because I loved them, and because loving people quietly was the only kind of love I knew how to give. Then my father died, and 3 weeks after the funeral, my mother sat me down at the same kitchen table where I'd done my homework as a kid, and told me the house I'd been secretly paying off since I was 28 years old, was going to my brother. Not split, not shared. His. This isn't a story about revenge. I want to say that up front, because most videos like this end with the villain getting what's coming to them, and the hero getting the house, the money, the apology. This one doesn't go that way. Stay until the end, because what actually happened taught me something about love that I didn't understand until it was almost too late to use it. My name doesn't matter much for this story, but I'll give you one anyway. Call me Mark. I grew up in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, in a 3-bedroom house on Halsey Street that my parents bought in 1994 with a 30-year mortgage they were still paying off when I turned 26. My father, Frank, worked at a machine shop for 31 years. My mother, Diane, did the books for a dental office and, on weekends, sold quilts at the county fair that nobody ever seemed to buy, but that she made anyway, every year, because it made her happy. I have one sibling. My brother Ryan is 4 years younger than me, and if you'd asked anyone in our town to describe the two of us growing up, they would have used the same 2 words every single time. I was the responsible one. Ryan was the fun one. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make Ryan into a cartoon villain, and he isn't one. He's charming. He's the guy who remembers your birthday and shows up late to help you move, but shows up. He borrowed money from our parents more times than any of us could count, and he always had a reason that sounded almost plausible. A business opportunity, a car repair, a friend in trouble. My parents always found a way to say yes to him. I don't think it was favoritism exactly. I think it was fear. Fear that if they said no, something worse would happen to him. I never scared them that way, so they never had to manage me the same way. I left for college on a partial scholarship, studied accounting, and by 26, I was working for a mid-sized firm in Columbus, about 90 minutes from Halsey Street. I married a woman named Sarah 2 years later. She's an occupational therapist, sharp and steady, the kind of person who notices things before you say them out loud. My parents' house was never fancy, but it was theirs, and it mattered to them in a way that went beyond square footage. My father used to say that house was the only thing in his life nobody could repossess. His words, not mine. And I never fully understood what he meant by that until years later. In 2018, my father's hours got cut, not eliminated. Cut. Enough that the household budget, which had never had much slack in it, suddenly had none. I found out almost by accident. I'd called on a Sunday to ask about a recipe, and my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that they were behind on the mortgage for the first time in 24 years. I remember sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot after that call, doing math in my head. I wasn't rich. Sarah and I were doing fine, not great. We had our own mortgage, we were saving for a house upgrade of our own. We didn't have kids yet, but we were thinking about it. But I had some room. Not a lot. Some. I called the mortgage company myself, gave them my parents' loan number, which I got by asking my mother for insurance purposes, and I asked what the monthly payment was. $940. I didn't decide that day to pay it for 6 years. I want to be honest about that, because this wasn't some grand, noble 5-year plan I mapped out on a whiteboard. I decided to cover it for a few months, quietly, until my dad's hours came back up. I set up an automatic transfer from an account Sarah and I didn't use much, a small side account from some freelance bookkeeping I did on weekends, directly to the mortgage servicer, using my parents' account number as the reference. A few months became a year became 3. My father's hours never really recovered the way any of us hoped, and somewhere in there, I stopped thinking of it as helping out temporarily, and started thinking of it as just something I did, the way some people have a gym membership, or a subscription they don't examine too closely on their bank statement. I never told my parents. That was the part that, looking back, probably needs the most explaining. It would have been so easy to just tell them, "Hey, I've got this, don't worry about the mortgage." But my father was a proud man. He'd lived through being the guy other men in the shop respected, because he never asked anyone for anything. I knew, with total certainty, that if I told him I was paying his mortgage, it would break something in him. He'd either refuse the money outright, plunging them into real trouble, or he'd accept it and spend every day afterward feeling like less of a man in his own house. I didn't want either of those things for him. So I let him believe he was doing it himself. I want to walk you through exactly how this worked, because the mechanics of the secret matter to what happens later. Every month, on the third, $940 left the account Sarah and I called the Extra Fund, and went straight to Halsey Street Savings and Loan, credited against loan number ending in 4,471. I didn't call it charity, even in my own head. I called it keeping the lights on. It felt less like rescue and more like maintenance, the same way you'd change the oil in a car you loved. The hardest part wasn't the money. Sarah and I could absorb $940 a month without it changing our lives in any dramatic way. We adjusted, we ate out less, we pushed our own house renovation back a couple of years. Small sacrifices that never once felt like sacrifices, because I knew what they were buying. The hard part was the performance. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Sunday phone call, I had to sit across from my father and listen to him talk about finally getting ahead of the mortgage again, or the extra shifts finally paying off. And I had to nod and say something like, "That's great, Dad," while knowing the truth sat in my chest, like a stone I'd swallowed on purpose. There's a particular kind of loneliness in doing something good that no one can ever know about. You'd think it would feel virtuous, and sometimes it did. But mostly, it felt like living two lives at once. The version of me my parents saw, a slightly distant son who visited on holidays and called on Sundays, and the version of me that existed only in a bank server somewhere, quietly making sure their world didn't collapse. Sarah knew. She was the only one. I remember the conversation where I told her what I wanted to do, sitting on the edge of our bed with my laptop open to the mortgage servicer's site. She didn't ask me why for very long. She just asked, "Are we going to be okay?" I told her yes, and she believed me, and that was the last real conversation we had about it for years. Every month after that, it just happened, the way you don't discuss breathing. My brother Ryan, during these same years, was living about 20 minutes from our parents, in and out of jobs, in and out of a couple of relationships, and in and out of my parents' wallet, in ways that were much less discreet than mine. There was the $4,000 for a food truck business that lasted 5 months. There was the $4,000 for a truck repair that turned out to be a truck he then sold 2 months later. There was a period where he lived in their basement for 8 months between apartments, rent-free, and my mother would tell me on the phone, almost apologetically, "He's just going through a rough patch." I never resented Ryan for this the way you might expect. Honestly, for a long time, I felt sorry for him. It seemed to me that being handed things too easily had made it harder for him to build anything that lasted, while having to earn everything myself had, in a strange way, given me something more solid to stand on. I thought I understood our family's dynamic completely. I did not. There's a moment I keep coming back to from around year 3 of the secret payments. My father had a minor health scare. Nothing catastrophic. A scare with his heart that turned out to be manageable with medication, and during the 2 days he was in the hospital, my mother mentioned to me, almost as a throwaway comment, that she'd been meaning to update their will one of these days, but that Frank always said there was no rush, since everything's going to Ryan anyway, since Mark's already got a good life set up. I didn't push back on that comment. I remember it landing somewhere in my chest and just sitting there, unexamined, the way you notice a crack in a wall and tell yourself you'll deal with it eventually. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I wasn't doing any of this for a house. And that was true. I genuinely wasn't. But there's a difference between not wanting something and being told, casually, in a hospital cafeteria, that you were never really considered for it in the first place. I kept sending $940 a month. By year 4, the amount of interest saved and principal paid down meant the mortgage balance had dropped by roughly $45,000 faster than it would have on my parents' income alone. I know this number precisely because I am, as you'll recall, an accountant, and some habits don't turn off just because the math in question is personal. I kept a private spreadsheet. Nobody ever saw it. I updated it every month, like a diary written in numbers instead of words. There were close calls. Twice, my father almost caught it. Once he mentioned that the mortgage company had called to double-check something on the account, and he'd been confused because he hadn't called them. I told him it was probably a scam call, that he should hang up on numbers he doesn't recognize. He believed me, because why wouldn't he? The second time was worse. My mother found a paper statement in the mail, this was maybe year 5, that referenced an external contributor on the account, in some fine print she didn't fully understand. She called me, not suspicious, just puzzled, and asked if I knew anything about mortgage insurance programs because she'd seen this weird line on a statement. I told her it was probably a cosigner notation from years back, something administrative and meaningless. She accepted that answer within about 30 seconds and moved on to asking about Sarah's sister's wedding. I remember hanging up that call and sitting in my parked car outside my office for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. It wasn't guilt about the money. It was the growing, uncomfortable awareness that I had built an entire architecture of small lies in order to do something entirely good, and that the architecture itself was starting to feel like its own kind of weight. I'm going to compress 6 years into this chapter, but I want you to understand that each of these years had its own texture, its own small crises and small joys, and that the secret sat underneath all of them, like a foundation nobody could see. Year 1. My father's hours partially came back, but not enough to cover the gap. I kept paying. Year 2. My mother's dental office cut her to part-time when the practice was sold to a corporate chain. I increased the transfer slightly to cover a spike in property taxes I found out about by calling the county assessor's office directly and pretending to be doing research for a client. Year 3, the health scare I mentioned. Also, the comment about the will. Year 4, Sarah and I had our first child, a daughter, Emma. I remember doing the math that year with new intensity, because now the sacrifice wasn't abstract. Every dollar going to Halsey Street was a dollar not going into Emma's college fund, not going toward the house upgrade Sarah and I had wanted for years. I didn't stop. I told myself I'd catch up later. I believed that, the way you believe most things that are convenient to believe. Year 5. Ryan asked our parents for money again. This time, nearly $9,000, for what he called a real opportunity. Finally, a stake in a friend's construction company. My mother told me about it afterward, a little sheepishly, saying, "We didn't really have it to give, but you know how he gets when he's disappointed." I didn't know they'd given it to him until after the fact. I found out, doing my quiet monthly check on the mortgage balance, that the extra principal I'd been paying down had essentially been erased that year by a home equity line they'd taken out to cover Ryan's $9,000. I want to be honest, that was the closest I ever came to telling them everything. I sat with that anger for almost 2 weeks. I drafted a text to my father in my notes app that started with, "I need to tell you something," and I deleted it 4 times. In the end, I didn't send it, because I kept coming back to the same question. What would telling them actually fix? It wouldn't get the $9,000 back. It would only make my father feel ashamed in front of the son he thought he'd never had to worry about. And it would make my mother feel caught between 2 sons in a way I didn't think she deserved. So I swallowed it. And I kept paying. And I adjusted my private spreadsheet. And I told myself the math would work out eventually, even though some part of me had started to suspect it never really would. Not in the way that mattered. Year 6 began normally. My father, now 68, had slowed down noticeably. Nothing anyone named directly, just a general softness to his movements. A habit of sitting down mid-conversation that he never used to have. I visited more that year, without quite admitting to myself why. Sarah noticed. She said once, gently, over dinner, "You've been going up there a lot." I told her I just wanted to see them more while I could. She didn't push, but I think she understood something I hadn't said out loud yet. In March of that 6th year, my father had a stroke. It wasn't the kind you fully recover from. He spent 11 days in the hospital, then came home with a walker and a speech therapist and a version of himself that was recognizably my dad, but slower, quieter, more easily tired. My mother, at 66, became a full-time caregiver almost overnight. I increased my support that spring, not just the mortgage anymore, but groceries, a ramp for the front porch, a portion of the in-home aides hourly rate that Medicare didn't cover. I still didn't tell them the scope of it. My mother thanked me for helping out here and there, genuinely believing that's all it was. Ryan, to his credit, showed up more that spring too. He mowed the lawn a few times. He sat with Dad on Saturday afternoons and watched baseball, which meant something. I'll admit that honestly. My father's face changed when Ryan walked in a way it never quite did for me. Not because Ryan loved him more, but because Ryan's presence had always felt like a treat rather than an obligation. That's just how it had always been between us. And by year 6 of this secret, I'd made a kind of peace with it. I told myself the money didn't need to come with recognition. I told myself love that requires an audience isn't really love, it's a performance, and I didn't want to perform. That was, I think, the most honest belief I held during those 6 years. It's also, I'd eventually learn, an incomplete one. In August, 7 months before what happened next, my father had a second, larger stroke. He didn't come home from the hospital that time. My father's funeral was on a Tuesday in late August, at the Lutheran church he'd attended sporadically for 40 years, and faithfully only in the last 5. More people showed up than I expected. Men from the machine shop, most retired now themselves, a few of my mother's old co-workers, neighbors from Halsey Street going back 3 decades. Ryan gave the eulogy. I want to say that plainly, without bitterness, because it's true, and it isn't really the point of this story. He was good at it, funny in the right places, warm, the kind of eulogy that makes a room feel like it's healing a little instead of just grieving. I sat in the second pew with Sarah and Emma, and I remember feeling proud of him and hollowed out at the same time, in a way I couldn't fully name. I didn't speak. Nobody asked me to, and I didn't offer. That was consistent with the shape our whole lives had taken. Ryan up front, me somewhere useful but unseen. After the funeral, in the fellowship hall, my mother hugged me for a long time, longer than she usually did, and said into my shoulder, "Your father was so proud of both of you, you know, in different ways." I said I knew. I'm not sure I fully believed it, but I said it anyway, because that's what you say. 3 weeks passed. My mother was staying, temporarily, in the house on Halsey Street, though we'd all begun the quiet, unspoken family conversation about whether she should keep living there alone or move somewhere smaller, somewhere with fewer stairs and fewer echoes. She called me on a Thursday evening in September and asked if I could come by that weekend. Just the 2 of us. I want to talk about some things with the estate. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was paperwork, insurance forms, maybe questions about the mortgage account she still didn't know I'd been managing, small administrative matters that fall to whoever in the family understands numbers, which had always been me. I drove up that Saturday alone. Sarah stayed home with Emma. I remember the drive specifically because it was one of those early autumn days where the light comes in sideways through the trees along Route 4, and I found myself thinking, with an odd mix of grief and something like peace, that my father would never see the leaves change again, and that the mortgage on that house, the one I'd been quietly keeping afloat for 6 years, would finally, this year, be paid off completely. I'd run the numbers the week before. 8 more payments, 8 more months, and it would be done, free and clear. A gift I'd never planned to announce, one I imagined my mother discovering only after I was gone myself, in some drawer full of old records, understanding finally what her son had done for her family without ever asking for a single thing in return. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because it matters for what comes next. I wasn't driving to that house hoping for anything. I was driving there at peace, genuinely at peace, with the idea that I would probably never receive credit for what I'd done, and that this was, in some sense, the whole point. My mother met me at the door with 2 cups of coffee already poured, the way she always had, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same one, same chipped edge on the left side, where I used to dig my pencil in as a kid doing math homework, and she pulled out a manila folder. "I wanted you to hear this from me," she said, "before the lawyer sends the official paperwork. Your father and I updated the will 2 years ago, after his first health scare. We should have told you both together, but with everything happening this year, it got away from us to have that conversation properly." I remember nodding, still thinking this was going to be about the mortgage, about some small clarification, about life insurance beneficiaries, something clean and procedural. "The house," she said, "is going to Ryan. Free and clear. Your father wanted it that way." I want to describe exactly what I felt in that moment, because I think it's the part of this story people relate to most, and I don't want to sand it down into something cleaner than it was. The first thing I felt wasn't anger. It was a kind of vertigo, the sensation of the floor tilting slightly under a chair I'd been sitting in comfortably for years. I heard myself ask, in a voice that sounded strangely calm to my own ears, "Can I ask why?" My mother explained, gently, the reasoning your father had apparently settled on. Ryan didn't have a place of his own. Ryan had struggled financially his whole adult life. Ryan, in my father's words as my mother relayed them, needs a foundation more than Mark does. Mark's always been able to build his own. She said my father had talked about it as a kind of insurance for Ryan's future, a way of making sure that no matter what happened, he'd always have a roof, since he'd never quite managed to secure one on his own. She told me they'd assumed, reasonably from their perspective, that I was financially secure. The accounting job, the marriage, the house in Columbus, the daughter starting a good school, and that giving me the family home on top of all that would have felt, to my father, almost like piling comfort on top of comfort, while leaving Ryan with nothing solid under his feet at all. Here is the detail that actually broke something in me, more than the house itself. My mother mentioned, almost as an aside, that my father had specifically noted in a conversation with the estate lawyer that the mortgage is basically paid down anyway, so whoever gets it is getting a real gift, free and clear. And she said this with a small, proud smile, genuinely unaware that the reason the mortgage was basically paid down was that I had been the one paying it, every month, for 6 years, in secret, using money that could have gone toward my own daughter's future. I didn't tell her in that moment. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't nobility, not entirely. It was shock. I sat there doing math in my head. The same reflex that had made me a good accountant made me, in that moment, calculate the exact dollar figure of what I'd contributed, and the number that came up was somewhere north of $68,000 in direct mortgage payments alone, not counting the ramp, the aid, the groceries, the small emergency repairs I'd covered over the years without ever mentioning them. $68,000, quietly given, about to become a house that would belong entirely to my brother, who had also, over that same period, received or lost somewhere north of $20,000 of our parents' money on ventures that never worked out, and who would now inherit, free and clear, an asset his older brother had effectively paid for. I finished my coffee. I told my mother I understood, that Dad's reasoning made sense in its own way, that I wasn't upset. I'm not sure she believed me completely, but she wanted to, and I let her. I drove home that evening with the windows down, even though it was getting cold, because I needed the noise of the road to fill the car instead of my own thoughts. I didn't cry. Not that day. I remember calling Sarah from the driveway before I went inside, sitting in the dark car for a few extra minutes, and telling her everything. The will, the house, the $68,000, all of it, in a flat, steady voice that surprised even me. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question I hadn't let myself ask yet. "Are you going to tell them what you did?" I told her I didn't know. Here is where this story splits from the kind of video you've probably seen 100 times before. In most of these stories, this is the part where the wronged sibling explodes, shows up at the next family gathering with bank statements printed out, humiliates the golden child in front of everyone, forces a dramatic reckoning at Thanksgiving dinner while relatives gasp. I didn't do that. partly because it isn't who I am, and partly because somewhere on that dark drive home, I'd landed on a harder truth, exposing the 6 years of payments now, in anger, in the raw weeks after my father's death, wouldn't restore anything that actually mattered to me. It would humiliate my grieving mother for a decision she made in good faith, based on incomplete information she never asked to be given incompletely. It would turn my father's memory, a man who, whatever his blind spots, had worked himself into the ground for his family, into the villain of a story he never got the chance to explain himself in. And it would hand Ryan a guilt he might carry for the rest of his life over a decision he hadn't even made. None of that math, I realized, actually served me. It would have felt good for about a day. Then I would have had to live in a family permanently reorganized around my anger, and I didn't want that legacy either. So for the next several weeks, I did something that I think took more discipline than anything else in this entire 6-year story. I kept paying the mortgage. Even after the will reading. Even knowing, now explicitly, that every dollar I sent was building equity in a house that would legally belong to my brother. I paid the final 8 months, right through to the end, until the mortgage on Halsey Street was completely, finally paid off, the way I'd always planned it, the way I'd imagined finishing it long before I knew the house would never legally be mine to walk away with. I did this for one reason, and it's the reason this video exists at all. My mother still lived there. Whatever the will said about ownership after her death, she was alive, and she was grieving, and she needed a paid-off house, with no monthly payment hanging over her fragile finances, far more than I needed to make a point by stopping. Punishing the house to punish the decision would have meant punishing her, and she hadn't made the decision alone. She'd simply agreed to trust a plan my father built based on assumptions nobody ever corrected, because I never gave anyone the chance to correct them. I also, quietly, started talking to an estate attorney of my own, not to contest the will, but to understand my actual legal position, and more importantly, to understand what options existed for my mother's benefit while she was still living. There's a difference between fighting for what I felt I deserved and making sure the people I loved were protected, regardless of what I deserved. I chose the second one, mostly because I'm not sure the first one would have made me feel any better even if I'd won it. Ryan, during this period, had no idea any of this was happening. He was simply told, along with me, that the house was his. He thanked our mother. He mentioned once, at a family dinner, that he was thinking about finally having something that was really mine, and my mother beamed at him in a way that, I'll admit honestly, still stung every time I thought about it. I said nothing. I smiled. I passed the mashed potatoes. The truth didn't come out because I told it. It came out because my mother found the spreadsheet. In November, cleaning out my father's old desktop computer to donate it to a church program, she came across a shared cloud folder I'd forgotten I once used on a family laptop years earlier, back before I set up my private tracking system on my own accounts. In it was an old, outdated version of my mortgage tracking spreadsheet from year 2 of the 6 years. Incomplete, but enough. Enough to show a recurring transfer of $940 a month, labeled simply Halsey MTG, going back to a date years before she'd have expected. She called me, and I could hear in her voice before she even finished the sentence that she already understood most of it. "Mark," she said, "what is this?" I told her the truth, all of it. Not with anger. I want to be clear about that, because I think the reason what happened next happened the way it did is that I told her without trying to make her feel guilty, without listing grievances, without turning it into a ledger of who owed whom. I told her because she'd found it, and because lying about it now would have been its own kind of betrayal, layered on top of the one I was still quietly absorbing. She was silent for almost a full minute on the phone. Then she said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. "Your father would have been so ashamed of us." Not of me, of them. She called Ryan the next day and told him everything, on her own, without asking me first, because she said it wasn't fair for her to carry that knowledge alone, while he lived in a house he didn't understand the true cost of. Ryan called me 2 days after that. It was not a smooth conversation. There was defensiveness in it at first. He asked why I hadn't just told them from the start, why I'd let this build up into some kind of secret sacrifice. A phrase that stung more than I expected, because it suggested I'd done it for effect, which wasn't true, but which I understood, in that moment, was a hard thing for him to separate from his own guilt. We argued. A little. Not badly. Mostly it was two grown men circling around a feeling neither of us had good language for. By the end of the call, he said something that mattered more to me than any apology could have. I don't want it like this. He meant the house. He said he couldn't live in it the same way anymore, knowing what he now knew, and he asked what I thought we should do. I told him the truth, which was that I didn't want to fight him for a house, and I didn't want our mother to lose her home over a legal argument between her sons while she was still grieving her husband. What I wanted, I told him, was much simpler and much harder to arrange on paper. I wanted us to figure out, together, as brothers, what actually made sense. Not what the will said, not what either of us felt entitled to, but what would actually take care of our mother and be fair to both of us going forward. Here's what we landed on, and I share it not because it's a perfect solution. I don't think perfect solutions exist in situations like this, but because it's honest, and because it's the actual ending, not a tidied-up one. Ryan and my mother agreed to formally amend the deed so the house is held jointly by my mother, for as long as she's living there, with equal remainder interest to both Ryan and me afterward. It required lawyers, patience, and more than one uncomfortable conversation, but it happened. Ryan didn't have to give anything up publicly or perform contrition for an audience. This wasn't about optics. It was two brothers quietly correcting a mistake that neither of us had actually made on our own. My mother, for her part, insisted on paying me back, in some form, for the 6 years of mortgage payments. I refused, for a long time, and eventually we settled on something that felt right to both of us. She set aside a portion of her modest savings, not as full repayment, which she couldn't have afforded anyway, but as a contribution toward Emma's college fund. A way of the sacrifice completing a full circle, instead of simply being erased. I still visit Halsey Street. My mother still makes coffee in the same chipped mug she's had since before I was born. Ryan comes by more now too, and something has shifted between us. Not into some sitcom version of newly close brothers, but into something quieter and more honest. We don't compete over who our parents loved more. We talk, sometimes, about what it actually costs to take care of people, and about how our father's plan, flawed as it was, came from a real place of trying to protect someone he worried about more, not from loving me less. I think that's the part I understand now, that I didn't understand for 6 years. My father wasn't wrong to worry about Ryan. He was wrong to make a plan about that worry, without ever checking his assumptions against the truth. And I was wrong, in my own way, for making it so easy for him to hold those assumptions, by hiding the truth so carefully that nobody ever had the chance to see it clearly until it was almost too late. Quiet love isn't automatically noble. Sometimes it's just love that never gave anyone the information they needed to treat you fairly. I don't regret helping my parents. I will never regret that. But I've learned that the people who love us can't act on truths we never let them see. If you've ever given more to your family than anyone knew, quietly, without asking for credit, I want to hear your story in the comments below. Not to compare wounds, but because I think more of us are carrying this kind of silence than we realize, and it helps to know we're not the only ones. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. We tell true-to-life family stories like this every week, the kind that don't end in easy villains or easy heroes, just people trying to figure out love under complicated circumstances. Thank you for spending an hour with me and my family's story. Take care of the people you love, and when you can, let them see what it's actually costing you.